Well, we're going to start this. Welcome to everyone. We really appreciate seeing you all and supporting Hodgkin's International in your own way. And we're really excited to have Stan Barta as our speaker today. And as Aaron mentioned prior, I really wasn't aware of Dr. Hodgkin, and you think we would know everything about him. So I'm really excited that Stan decided to enlighten us today and share his wisdom. And Stan is a 47-year survivor. And Stan, can you please tell us about yourself?
Sure. I am, as Kathy said, 47-year survivor. I was diagnosed with pediatric Hodgkin's disease at age 13 and went through about 5 years of treatment. This was all in Seattle, Virginia Mason Hospital, which was a couple 100-mile drive from home. So every time we had to go to the doctor, it was at least 4 hours each way in the car. I had, over those years, I had probably 4 surgeries. I had the MOP regimen, chemotherapy, and I had total nodal radiation in 3 separate sections. So it began with mantle radiation, later was periaortic, and then inverted Y inguinal region. So I've had all of the radiation that I can have. I was pronounced with complete remission, I guess were the words they used, right about the time I graduated from high school, and was essentially very healthy for the next 30 years. It's been just the last 10 years or so that one health issue after another have been coming up, and only 5 years or less since I heard of the concept of a survivorship clinic and went to one where they helped me piece together all that was beginning to unfold in my health, and got a little more focused approach to it with the cardiologists that I needed to see and endocrinologists and whatnot. So these days I'm a heart failure and coronary artery disease patient, at a Swedish hospital also in Seattle, but doing well.
Great. I do have a couple housekeeping things. Hodgkin's International has launched a YouTube channel. So we make our videos available. If you prefer not to have your name or any identifying information on your screen, you could take that off. And as Stan starts his talk, if you could please mute yourself and shut off your video. At the end, we're going to take questions, so please add your questions to chat. And maybe I'll mention this now. We do have an upcoming Zoom conference, and that's with Julie Rowland, March 1st. And I can't believe that that's coming up already. So that's March 1st, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you could see that event on hodgkinsinternational.com. Okay, so if you'd want, great, everybody has taken off themselves from video. So Stan, we welcome your talk.
All right, thanks. I will do my best. I will be a little technologically challenged because I've not done this before, but I do have a few slides I'm going to try and show periodically throughout. Let me try and open it now. Okay, there we go. I did not really pursue any studies of finding out who Dr. Thomas Hodgkin was until the last year or so. I'd always wondered, I suppose, but had never dug in and made any attempt to do any research until after I found this group. And I asked Erin at one point if she'd be interested in my just writing up a short biography of the man. I was just interested in reading his biography and thought it would be something that she'd like to share on the website. So she asked if I would be willing to do a presentation like this, which then led to a lot more reading and studying on my part. I have primarily used two sources. I'm hoping that on my screen, my picture is covering part of that. I hope that's not the case on everybody's screen. Okay. The two primary sources that I used in studying his life's history were these two books. If, like me, you like to occasionally read a good biography, I could recommend either one of them. They are different in character from one another, and that the writing style is different. One of them is quicker to read than the other. One of the authors did have the benefit of befriending the Hodgkin family some years ago, and were loaned all of the family's papers and just voluminous correspondence that had been written to and by Dr. Hodgkin. So there was a lot of personal insights available to the authors, to the Casses, the authors of the book on the left, which if you're willing to invest in a 500-page story is, I think, worth the time. It's the smoother read of the two books. The other book is also good. He does happen to lean on the Casses book a bit as a resource. He also is a physician, and I think he probably had more of an aim of writing for busy physicians who wanted to know something about the history of Hodgkin but just wanted the facts. So it's a bit briefer at about 350 pages, not quite as smooth of a read because he bounces you back and forth between the man's biographical story and cultural and historical details of what's happening in culture and in the world at the time. So you're back and forth. It's a little clunkier to read, I guess, but both of them I found really valuable. These authors, I just want to be sure to say, are the ones who did all the heavy lifting. I am not a professional researcher at all. I relied fully on these two authors and a handful of journal articles. So about 1,000 pages of material to read multiple times and try and glean enough of an outline to have a presentation for you today. To understand Hodgkin at all, you will necessarily be immediately faced with needing to learn at least simple foundational information about everything from Victorian England, the culture and politics, the Society of Friends, or the Quaker Church, as you might know it, ethnic studies, particularly with North American Indians, the far North American Indians, the area of Canada, Australian Aborigines, the New Zealand Maori tribes, the African slave trade, abolition, and the founding of the nation of Liberia. He played a key role in all of those things, as he was an anti-slavery advocate his entire adult life. You'll learn a bit about Palestine, particularly the poorest of the Jews who lived there in and around the area of Jerusalem during his lifetime. And you'll learn a good bit about the state of European medical practice from the early to mid 19th century on the continent and in England. And it seems that during his lifetime, England was measurably behind the continent in the sophistication of their medical practice and the uniformity of their licensing and regulation practices for new doctors. So all of that comes into Hodgkin's story. And then just to take one more minute for introductory info before I really get into his story, to help set the stage, I guess, in your mind for what is happening in the world at that time, just various parts of the world. This is just grabbing bits and pieces from world history, politics, culture, all over the place. This is Hodgkin's world. The French Revolution was underway. King Louis XVI was beheaded near the time Hodgkin was born. Napoleon was just beginning his moves throughout Europe. In the US, President Jefferson had just made the Louisiana Purchase, providing funds, incidentally, for Napoleon's work in Europe. Lewis and Clark expedition was just departing to go explore this new Louisiana Purchase, and still looked for the fabled Northwest Passage. The War of 1812 happened. Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte were beginning to publish. The nation of Liberia was founded, and we'll say more about that later. Queen Victoria was crowned. Charles Dickens began publishing. Darwin, who was a friend, professional acquaintance of Hodgkin's, left on his trip on the Beagle and then returned to spend years working on the origin of species. The first steamship crossed the Atlantic. The telegraph was invented. The Irish experienced a tremendous famine, and they became one of the largest immigrant groups for a period of some years, moving to America. Ether was invented as an anesthetic, and prior to this time, during Hodgkin's younger years, there really was no anesthesia during surgery. There was whiskey, opium, and maybe 4 strong men to hold the patient down on the table while the doctor did their work. Syringes were invented. Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto. Antiseptic surgery was developed. The American Civil War came and went, and the American 13th Amendment, the Anti-Slavery Amendment, was passed. Okay, now let's get to the facts of Hodgkin's life. One of the authors uses this quote early in his book, and I'm gonna read it here because it really touches on the character of Hodgkin and the kind of man he was and how driven he was in life. The quote is by Rabbi Tarfon and says, "The work is not yours to finish, but neither are you free to take no part in it." This seemed to be the kind of thinking that drove Hodgkin throughout his life. He was born in August of 1798 in a small village of Pentonville, north of London, and he was born into a deeply religious Quaker family, the Society of Friends, as they were referred to, and it shaped and guided his entire life. There would be times later in his life where he would be at odds with the church, even to fairly extreme personal conflict with the church, but never did he consider leaving it, and he never did till his dying days. His family's focus during the course of his life was raising their 2 sons focused on scripture, on Quaker doctrine, Quaker history. He was an observant follower of their church's teachings throughout his life. He attended religious services at least twice a week, essentially for his entire life, whether he was in England and, if possible, while traveling. He remained respectfully devoted to and sought the advice of his parents throughout his life. Well into adulthood, he was still considered it the duty of a responsible son, as he was, to consult his parents whether he was considering investments, job changes, relocations, or marriage. And there are some records left of those conversations in the letters that the family shared with the authors of these books. He was distinctive in his social group for being a very conservative Quaker. For one, he dressed the part his entire life, dressed all in black, unadorned, wore the wide, flat-brimmed black hat. Even after it went out of fashion in the Quaker church, by the time he was in his 50s and 60s, the majority of Quakers weren't dressing that way anymore. He still did. Also, he spoke formally, always using these and thous, and it had long gone out of fashion in wider British society at the time. So he stood out in that way as well, even spoke formally in that way to his wife and in final letters that he wrote to her within days of his death. Homeschooled, as we might say these days, His father was well educated and was a sought after personal tutor himself, so highly educated. They raised their boys at home, taught them as far as they were qualified to teach, and then would hire tutors to come into the house with further higher level studies. So by the time he finished that level of schooling, he was conversant in Greek, Latin, French, and later he picked up Italian and German himself. He very early on developed interests in the sciences, all branches of science. As a boy, it was especially geology. He loved going out rock collecting, exploring, and finding and studying those kinds of materials. Also, the concept of electrical current had been discovered or at that time. And once he was introduced to that by demonstrations, he used to enjoy playing with electricity and trying to invent batteries, put together combinations of things that would create batteries and then transmit electrical currents so that he could demonstrate it to others. His family traveled usually away from the city, away from London in the summertime, and they would often go spend that time with family. He had one particular cousin by the name of Sarah Rickman, who was his age, and the two of them got along famously. And as they entered their teenage years, they began to develop a romance, which as soon as his family was aware of it, they tried always to discourage, but it was there and seemed to be just a natural connection and relationship between those two from early on. As he got into his late teenage years, he and his family began to discuss the question, so where would he go? What would he be doing for a career in his life? One of the things that they had to take into consideration was, obviously, he was suited to a university education, but being considered dissenters or nonconformists to the Church of England, he would not be allowed to go to either of the two big universities, Cambridge or Oxford. You had to assent to the teachings of the Church of England to attend and graduate from those schools. So whatever he chose was going to be have to be in another location, perhaps on the continent. One thing to note about his personality that everyone noticed in time, certainly from his teenage years on and all the way through adulthood, one of his relatives commented later in life about it too, was Thomas was a champion of all sorts of lost causes who could flame up into very hot wrath when he heard of acts of oppression on his proteges, and he was not sparing of sharp censure on the transgressors. He was a man who spoke his mind. If he saw something, he said something. If he saw what he considered to be an injustice being done, he dove right into the fray, dove right into the middle of it, could not keep his mouth shut, would do his best to try and right the wrong and try and get the parties talking, trying to get agreement from the person he most disagreed with to bring the two parties together. That was part of his life always. And so it was a natural part of his temperament. It well suited him to becoming involved even as early as his teenage years in anti-slavery and abolition movements. In his late teenage years, let's see, he would have been 18 or 19 years old, so 18, 17. His family helped him arrange an apothecary apprenticeship with a man named William Allen, who they knew through the Quaker Church and who was a former student of Thomas's father. William Allen was now practicing apothecary. He lived and worked in an area called, I believe, Plough Court. He was highly respected in the community in his work. He was also a partner in owning a chemical firm, and he was a part-time lecturer in topics like chemistry at Guy's Hospital in London. He was a very busy philanthropist. He was often away from home, at least locally, for periods of time, being involved in various philanthropic activities. He also frequently had significant guests in his home as they were trying to work through the work within the abolitionist movement and continuing to work towards outlawing slavery in the colonies. Slavery had been illegal in England since 1772, but in the colonies, that didn't happen until 1834. So there was a lot of work happening. A frequent visitor in William Allen's home was William Wilberforce, a name you're probably familiar with, who was the leader of the abolition movement in Parliament. Another was Thomas Clarkson, who played a major role all of his life in working towards outlawing slavery. So as Thomas was brought into this apprenticeship, it was common for the apprentice to live in his master's home, and he did enter into this long-promised, but what turned out to be short-lived apothecary apprenticeship. He was, while there, exposed to this thinking. He was welcome to sit in on the conversations. William Allen used him as a secretary at times, so he was involved in penning the correspondence between the various groups who were involved in the abolition movement at that time. So again, from an early age, he was exposed to all angles and all arguments against slavery. One of the things that was happening at that time was that Britain was advocating the use of Sierra Leone as a place for freedmen, folks who had been freed from slavery, to go and as a colony of sorts, but specifically for freed slaves. Hodgkin, well, let me take half a step back. I said that his apothecary apprenticeship there was short-lived. It's not clear why. It's very possibly because William Allen's own home was in a bit of disarray at the time. He had just been widowed right at the time that Thomas came onto the scene to become an apprentice there. So he was never quite organized enough to give Thomas the structured setting that he needed for a proper apprenticeship. So when barely a year had passed, Thomas's parents found a second apprenticeship for him, again with a highly respected Quaker apothecary firm, Glazier and Kemp. It was very early on then, because of all this exposure to these topics of anti-slavery, that Thomas began to form pretty firm opinions that he favored working with or favored the positions of what was called the American Colonization Society instead of pure abolitionists. He considered the abolitionists to be espousing what he called immediatism, which was slavery needs to end now, immediately, fully. Everyone who is enslaved needs to be turned loose this minute and turned loose in society, and no recompense, no financial recompense to any slaveholders. Hodgkin always thought, or came to believe early on in his forming his opinions, even as a teenager, that that would probably lead to disaster in society, because so many businesses and even international trade were now based on a functioning slave economy, especially in the areas of cotton production and tobacco, and then transatlantic trade involving those things between the US and Europe. So he favored, or came to favor, something that was a little slower in the transition. Absolutely believed slavery was wrong, but that it was going to take time, moving current slaves through something more like an apprenticeship to make sure that they had the skills to survive on their own before they were turned loose. We'll come back to that later, because this is going to play a role in his life until his dying days. And even if I'm not discussing it as we move into talking about his medical career, all of this and all of his involvements and all of his letter writing and his maintenance of relationships with various anti-slavery groups near and far is going on constantly. It's a big part of the work that he does. And apothecaries, just a quick insight into that. They were, of course, the precursors to today's pharmacists, at least that's what we call them in America. Apothecaries' primary role was compounding and selling medicinal herbs as prescribed by physicians. There weren't a lot of chemical type medications. It was primarily herbs. During the course of their practice, apothecaries who were licensed by a 5-year apprenticeship, which included 6 to 12 months of, quote, walking the wards, that meant basically shadowing physicians in a hospital setting so they'd have an up close and personal view of what the medical practice was like. During the course of doing their apothecary work, they would, of course, pick up bits and pieces, dribs and drabs of medical knowledge, some accurate and some not. And so, at least in Britain, apothecaries began to practice medicine to a degree. During the early part of Hodgkin's life, there was a distinct shortage of physicians in England. There weren't enough to go around. The wealthier people could hire a doctor to come visit them at their home or even to travel with them and provide the best quality medical care. The poorest of the poor often didn't have the ability to pay a doctor at all. They might go to the apothecary if they thought they needed something to treat an illness. The apothecary might dispense knowledge. They weren't allowed by the government to charge for that type of practicing medicine. They could charge for selling medications. It became a part of the practice of too many of them, an unethical practice of adulterating the product. They'd add something to it, whether it was ground up grain products or what have you, add it to the herbs they were selling to make it go farther, to increase their income. Quakers were known to not do that. They were thought of as the most ethical in that trade, and so they were sought out. And certainly that was the caliber of good men that Hodgkin was working under in his apprenticeship. Well, during his apprenticeship, when he had reached about age 20, he happened to inherit 2 houses, some stocks, and cash. And his father helped him to invest that well so that he was fairly well set for the rest of his life. He would have some periods of time where he made really unwise financial decisions, lost large sums of money through that. Nevertheless, and he was never wealthy, but he always had enough to be comfortable. And then later, when he was earning through his various positions as a physician, he added to that income source. So he was comfortably off. Now, as he's getting near the end of his apprenticeship, his relationship with that first cousin, Sarah Rickman, we're going to call her Sarah number 1, that relationship is growing. His family is giving more and more vehement no's to that relationship. They don't want to see it go further. And the church, the Quaker church, had stepped in and pointed out to him quite adamantly that marriage between first cousins is absolutely forbidden within this church. It cannot happen. So with those 2 forces allied against him, the relationship didn't grow too far for too long. One of the things that Hodgkin did also during his apprenticeship, and this seems to have been at his own by his own motivation. I don't think that anyone else asked him to do this or suggested that he do it, but as he began putting together his thoughts about this whole concept of slavery and abolition and the mistreatment of indigenous peoples in countries that had been colonized by Britain, he began writing an essay, and he spent, I believe, well over a year writing it. It's called An Essay on the Promotion of Civilization. And essentially what it turned out to be was his indictment of Europeans who were lured by the possibilities of wealth in colonized countries or in newly discovered portions of the continents afar. He was particularly disgruntled by the conquests and settlements that were destroying the North American Indians in the northern reaches of Canada, in Australia, and in New Zealand. And also had particularly unkind things to say throughout most of his life about the effects that Christian missionaries had while doing their work among indigenous people. He felt that in fact, he should have written the quote down and I didn't, but he essentially said, no group of people in the history of the world has done more damage to the health or the moral well-being of the indigenous peoples than Christian missionaries, which for someone who was as dedicated a part of his own church was quite astounding. Something that he discovered during the course of his apprenticeships was that he had no natural abilities and no taste for business or finance. He was never good at finance, and he finally realized that it was so distasteful to him that the apothecary business was probably at least slightly the wrong direction for him. Shortly after that time is when he decided to alter his direction and pursue physician's training. One problem that was going to bring up, as I alluded to earlier, since he couldn't go to school at Cambridge or Oxford, being part of the dissenting church, was that he'd have to pursue his doctorate outside of England. And then he'd have to hope for the best when he returned to England with an MD degree, in the hope that the licentiate of the Royal College of Physicians would grant him license to practice in England, because they too their fellows were primarily made up of members of the Church of England, though they weren't bound by quite as strict rulings that no one could be licensed, in the sense that the two schools had said no one can graduate from here who is not in agreement with the church's teachings. So as it turned out, later he would not have a problem with that, but that was always a risk. So near the end of what would have been the end of his apothecary apprenticeship, he entered Guy's Hospital in London as a physician's pupil. This was in 1819, so he's 21 years old. The next year, he entered the University of Edinburgh to become a student there in their medical program. While he's there, Sarah Rickman, Sarah number one, travels up to visit some of her family who are near the college, and once again, their relationship is rekindled. Again, the family, when they do finally find out about it, he tends to be, he tried to be a little more, use a little more subterfuge in pursuing the relationship at this time. When the family found out, they were still completely discouraging of it. And this time, to a more strident degree, I guess, he pursued the conversation with the church, trying to press them to lighten up and to change their rules so that he could marry his cousin. The church said no, his family still said no. In 1821, after his first, I believe, 2 years at Edinburgh, he went to Paris to pursue some more of his education there, partly because France at that time had some of the highest quality medical education on the continent. They were particularly good at teaching anatomy and particularly good at, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. While he was in France, he lived there for a year. He made all kinds of connections with highly skilled physicians and people who were as enthusiastic and capable as he was academically. And he got quickly involved with other scientists who were studying different angles of science that would lead to new discoveries that would benefit the entire medical community. One of them was with a man named Laennec, who had invented the stethoscope. And though the stethoscope of similar design had been introduced to England, it wasn't being used there. It was scoffed at. It was thought of as just sort of a toy. And see if I can get a picture of it up here. There we go. This may have been Hodgkin's own stethoscope. This was the type of stethoscope he and Laennec were using at the time. And he learned to use it well. He was completely sold on the idea. And not only that, but over the next year or so, as the two of them did studies together and used it more and more, both of them were men who were highly attentive to detail, very capable of clearly explaining in writing and presentations what they were learning through their experiments. And they published on what they were learning through auscultation, listening to patients' various body areas, particularly the chest, through a stethoscope, and then comparing it to what was discovered about those patients at autopsy if they died of their diseases. And a modern physician, someone fairly recently, has gone so far as to say that Laennec and Hodgkin were so focused, so accurate, and communicated their findings so well that very little substantively has been added to the understanding of what can be accomplished with a stethoscope in the last 150 years. So they were good, and Hodgkin brought it back when he did the following year come back to England to Guy's Hospital, brought it back with enthusiasm and got the medical community using it more widely. Well, in 1823 is when Hodgkin finally graduated. Hodgkin finally graduated from Edinburgh, and his thesis was the absorbent qualities of blood, lymph glands, and spleen, kind of the beginning of his interest in that portion of the body. Right out of school, as soon as he finished, as I said earlier, he did not have any trouble receiving his licentiate from the Royal College of Physicians, but he decided not to go straight home to England to practice medicine, much to his parents' chagrin. They wanted him to come home. His mother, in particular, had always worried about the time that he was spending in Paris for fear of the cultural influences that he would be subjected to there as a nice religious boy. And so they were not totally on board when he decided to first spend a year as a traveling physician. He was hired by a man named Abraham Montefiore, and who was British. He was quite ill with tuberculosis, and he and his wife hired Hodgkin to travel with them around the continent as they tried to find a place where the climate was more suitable to Montefiore, hopefully leading him to some healing. During the course of that year, Hodgkin met Abraham's older brother, Moses Montefiore. The two of them became lifelong friends, quite close, and they'd end up in later years, we'll hear a good bit more about them, traveling all around Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East, particularly Palestine. Well, Hodgkin stayed on for finished that travel of a year with Montefiore, and then spent a second year in Paris, again, because the accessibility of medical education was so great, because he was so welcomed and embraced by practicing physicians in the hospitals there, that he was learning much by following them on their rounds as well. During the course of that time, through social connections, he met Sarah number two, Sarah Bowditch, who was a highly educated woman. She had been married to a man who was an explorer, I believe a physician, and he had died recently while he was out of the country. She and Hodgkin hit it off, and he was quite interested in marrying her. She was not a relative of his. She was not a Quaker, but she was willing to consider converting. And he actually wrote home to ask his father's advice about this marriage. And there's no record can be found of the response. They didn't marry. So we can assume perhaps that it was in the negative. She was, again, highly educated. She went on to become an author and an artist herself, very accomplished. Hodgkin at that point, somewhere during that second year in Paris, and when it appeared they had decided not to get married, he came back to London finally, Guy's Hospital had just opened a medical school tied to the hospital. It was high quality, highly thought of. It was run primarily by a man named Harrison, whose title was treasurer. And he was known to be an extreme autocrat in the way he ruled. He ruled the place with an iron fist. Also, during his tenure, the hospital and the school became known for extreme nepotism. Lecture positions were being handed down from father to son, not from one person to someone who was equally or better qualified when the opening came available. And that presented a problem for people like Hodgkin later on. Medical field was going through significant changes at this time. They were just coming to terms with the concept that diseases differ. It isn't just that there's a state of health and a state of dis-ease where the bodily fluids or the bodily humors are out of balance and we need to correct that or bleed the patient to help bring those kinds of things back into balance. The concept of pathologic anatomy, that is studying specifically the appearances of body parts during an illness, after an illness, immediately after death, and comparing them was what was needed and was just beginning. Medical students in England at this time were used to getting their anatomical training from cadavers that might be weeks old at least. And there was truly a problem with grave robbing on the part of people affiliated with colleges of trying to find enough cadavers for education of the medical students. So students at that time couldn't be sure if they were seeing changes in bodily organs that were a result of decay because of the long time since death, or if they were a result of a disease process, or if maybe this was normally what these body parts looked like in a healthy person. So in a sense, medicine was very, the word medieval comes to mind. It was very simplistic compared to what we think of as far more scientific and evidence-based today. One of the advances that French medicine was making ahead of England at this time was they were beginning to embrace statistics and precise data collection from patients and illnesses as far as where illnesses were happening, if they were congregating in certain geographical areas that could give evidences as to what might be the etiology of these illnesses. It was going to be some time before English medicine would begin to embrace and trust numbers like that. Another thing that Hodgkin was involved in right at this transition time of moving home from his studies in France to the time he really set up busy practice in London was he was working with a doctor named Lister. This Dr. Lister was the father of the Dr. Lister who would develop antiseptic surgery a few decades later and just before the end of Hodgkin's life. This Dr. Lister was working with the newly developed microscopes, and they were, he knew they had to be useful in medicine. Not a lot was known or understood about things at the cellular level at that time. And microscopes still had a lot of problems with the technology being used to create the lenses. The lenses created, can't think of the word, chemobrain. They created aberrations. They created unusual spots and areas in the visual field so that the viewer, the doctor, couldn't be sure, is this something that is truly there? Am I really seeing this thing on this piece of tissue? Or is this something that's caused by a defect in the glass, essentially? So Lister, and then to a smaller degree, Hodgkin with him, were studying and trying to perfect how these lenses could be used in diagnosis and in production of slides to be useful in health. Along the way, the two of them discovered things like the visual evidence that red blood cells are biconcave discs. That was a new discovery. That muscle cells are striated and differentiated in that way from other cellular tissues. They uncovered the fact that arteries have 3 layers in the walls. These were huge discoveries and really attributed to the tenacity of men like Hodgkin and Lister and these other doctors. They were so detail focused, such clear communicators, and they were so serious about the work they were doing and then communicating it onward. One unfortunate thing that happened right as Hodgkin was leaving Paris was that he, without his parents' advice and in fact against their advice, he began making some unwise investments, got involved in some investment schemes with a man named Sargent, who he trusted. People who knew Hodgkin well said that he tended to always trust people based on his first impressions, and often trusted people before they should be trusted. This happened to him multiple times over with this man in investments. He lost a lot of money over a period of years because of the investments and then continuing to hand the man more money to try and make things right in their latest scheme. Finally, his family enticed him back to London, and he entered employment in part with Guy's Hospital. He was given a post as a physician among the London dispensaries, which were essentially community health centers for the poorest of the poor. He developed a real passion for working with the poor and a real appreciation for the difficulties of their lives and how it could lead to health compromises and issues because of lack of nutrition, lack of cleanliness. Simultaneously, this new friend, Moses Montefiore, found him a role as physician to 2 Jewish aid societies to work with the poorest immigrant Jews who were coming to Britain. He was hired directly by the hospital to be their inspector of the dead, essentially what we might call a coroner or a forensic pathologist, and the curator of their hospital museum to take materials, body parts from autopsies and create and preserve usable things that could be chemobrain. They could be used by medical students in furthering their education. He even developed while he was there something that he had observed in France. He developed a new take on it of some type of injection materials they could put into, say, a heart or a lung, and essentially fill it from the inside out, then let the actual biological material decay and end up with a model that was shaped and very similar in appearances to the original organ, and use that for studies. Hodgkin was perfectly suited to these roles at Guy's Hospital for the same reasons as I've said previously, because of his detail focus and because of his meticulous attention to writing things out, keeping records, keeping logs. He, along the way, he managed to create a heated debate early in his tenure there by pointing out what he considered to be the deficiencies in English medical education. Remember, he's the new kid on the block. He's a new medical student, a new doctor. He's just been hired, and already when he's given the podium, he's speaking on the deficiencies of the English medical education system. They need to improve their study of anatomy. They need to begin keeping detailed case histories of patients, which just wasn't being done. They need to have regular patient follow-up appointments. They need to always do detailed autopsy reports and then link all of those things together for every given patient. The case histories, the regular patient follow-ups and histories, the autopsy reports, link them together, make them available in writing so that other students can learn from doctors' experience. He did, while he was there at Guy's Hospital, he went on to begin teaching one of the first ever pathology courses in England because he was well suited to the topic. He apparently wasn't the greatest lecturer because he could wander and become quite verbose, but still was very good at the topic, very good at his subject. He cataloged thousands of specimens for Guy's Hospital during the time that he was there. And their hospital museum was really a wonder. One of the things that he did in his tenure there, while he was working with the clinics, the community health clinics, was he kind of connected with some of the social reformist groups and tried to help disseminate details of everything from recent scientific developments to the arts, to economics. He wanted to tie these things together, link some of them as appropriate back to how they could benefit health, then put together a series of 4 talks, and he gave those talks in public venues to the people who lived in these poor working class communities, and eventually published those talks in a book format too. They were well received. He managed to tie them in very effectively to skills on everything from the value of fresh air to staying clear of sewage and dispensing appropriately with sewage away from sources of fresh water and away from habitation. Topics as seem as simple as bathing, diet, digestion, and tied this all back to behaviors that could be changed, learned and changed among the population to improve overall health. So he did a really great job of that in the community. You know, when you think of that, think back to those 4 or 5 things he was hired to do at Guy's Hospital. You think of all of the abolition and anti-slavery work that he was doing. And you have to remember, all of this was going on simultaneously. He never stopped with any of it. He was doing all of it at the same time. Well, this is where we enter the picture. It's going to be, it may seem anticlimactic, but here we go. In 1832, he gives a presentation, actually a 2-night presentation, pulling together some studies that he's been doing over the last 5 or 6 years, where he had begun to notice some unusual patterns among the lymph glands and spleens of some of the cadavers he was working on. The topic, you can see here, the cover page. He was so skilled at noticing details, focusing on details, that he could see, as he was doing large numbers of autopsies, that even though at first glance these patients looked like people who merely had very advanced tuberculosis, still there was something different about the pattern with which their lymph glands were being found enlarged, groupings of them moving progressively through the body, and the fact that the spleen was involved and that they had specific palpable characteristics that were somehow different than what he had been seeing in tuberculosis patients. Now, it's true, with tuberculosis being as widespread as it was in these days, many, if not all of these patients had both tuberculosis and what would become known as Hodgkin lymphoma at the same time. And it couldn't even be certain which of the two had killed some of the patients. It not being the norm for the poorer class to come into hospital or to come to a doctor's office early on, most of these patients had very far advanced Hodgkin's disease by the time they were even seen by a doctor. And most were, if not all, were sent home to die because they didn't know what it was, much less how to treat it. One of the doctors that Hodgkin was working with, when he began to point out to other doctors that, you know, I'm seeing a pattern here. Have you seen anything like this? One of the doctors was named Carswell, who also happened to be quite an artist. And while he was at another hospital, he came upon at least one case of what he thought Hodgkin was describing. And so he did at the autopsy of a newly dead patient. He drew this, and it became part of Hodgkin's report because it so well represented what he was seeing himself in patients. I believe 7 patients were involved in Hodgkin's studies over this period of 5 or 6 years. And over the years, as diagnosis and histology have become more and more sophisticated, and certainly after the Reed-Sternberg cells were discovered at the turn of the 20th century, they ruled out a couple of these. Probably only 4 of this original 7 really were what would today be called Hodgkin's disease or Hodgkin lymphoma. Still, it was understandable why they would appear to be so. They were so close in resemblance. And these tissue samples still exist. They're still owned by the hospital, and from time to time over the years, as diagnostic means have gotten more sophisticated, more tissue samples have been taken from them and studied further. They're still well preserved and do exist. That may be kind of anticlimactic to what we were hoping to hear about this great discovery of Hodgkin lymphoma. That's it, really. It isn't even named yet. The striking part of it is that it took a doctor of Hodgkin's tenacity and his attention to detail and his commitment to clear communication that it was discovered as early as it was. Someone else surely would have. In fact, about 20 years later, a doctor named Wilkes, also from Guy's Hospital, after Hodgkin had moved on past this and wasn't working on this particular topic anymore, Wilkes discovered, that's Miss Scarlett. She needed to be heard. Dr. Wilkes wasn't aware of Hodgkin's original studies. He began to discover some similar things, and he wrote a paper on it. And just before it was published, it was pointed out to him, well, haven't you read Hodgkin's paper? Back in 32, he presented on this topic a group of patients. So Wilkes does give in the footnote of his paper in 1856 that, in fact, he's not the discoverer of this, that Hodgkin discovered it. 10 years later, when Wilkes writes a second paper, this paper is the first time, and you see it up there in small script near the top, it's the first time that it's referred to as Hodgkin's disease. And from that day forward, the name stuck. So Hodgkin finally received his due, and the disease carried that eponym from that point on. Let's see.
Excuse me, Stan.
Yes.
This is the 15-minute warning that you asked for.
Okay,
we
very
allowed
good.
for an hour and a half, but we can go much longer if you'd like.
Okay, I will. I'm going to try and pick it up a little bit, but I think I'm doing well. Thanks. This is just a simple timeline of his life. Brings it up to the point we've just talked about, highlighted in yellow, the 2 papers that I just showed you. And you can see Hodgkin's getting near the end of his life. Now, this is taking just a bit of a leap ahead because there's some really important stuff relative to his career to cover next. As I said, Hodgkin was constantly busy in the anti-slavery movement on his own time outside of his medical career. The nation of Liberia is being put together actually by what we would today call an NGO, a non-governmental group, has carved out a chunk of land on the west coast of Africa with the intention that someday it be recognized as a country, develop its own government, etc., and be a receiving place for freed American slaves. So this is an American-based anti-slavery organization that's started the process. Hodgkin becomes involved in that process early on, and so he's in constant communication with them, and he's supportive of several explorers who go into the area and who are trying to find ways to bring this to pass in what will become the nation of Liberia. March 1837, about 5 years after he had made his discovery, his presentation on what would become Hodgkin lymphoma. He worked himself sick. He became suddenly extremely ill, and his doctors ordered him to at least several weeks of bed rest. The doctors told his family, "This has got to stop. He is doing the work of 4 men. He has got to begin to learn moderation, or he's not going to survive this." It was never clear through the letters and documents that have survived, what was it? What was happening to him? Was it something like epilepsy? Phrases like narcolepsy, seizures were used in very generic terms, but they were being bandied about at that time in reference to him. And it is true that there was some type of seizure disorder that ran in his descendants through his brother. He himself didn't have children. Wasn't clear what it was, but his family took him out of the city and to a relative's home out of town. And Sarah number 1, who had since gone on to be married but was now widowed, is who came in to nurse him back to health in their relative's home. She was particularly good at nursing, and everybody in the family was comfortable with that. So for a number of weeks, he was there, and he was slowly improving when a friend of his came up, contacted him, and said, "You've got to come down to Guy's Hospital immediately. An unexpected opening has happened because of a death among the faculty, and your dream job has just opened up. You've got to get down there and try to talk to King Harrison and get your application in front of him for this position. This is what you've been waiting for. This is where you want your career to go and where you'll end your professional days." Hodgkin did get out of his sickbed and run headlong into the application process. He, however, had badly set the stage badly months ahead of this between himself and King Harrison. He had written at one point some scathing letters to Harrison about the behavior of the Hudson's Bay Company in the way they treated and mistreated the Indians of northern Canada in the land that they were in charge of. And they had, according to Hodgkin's interpretation of it through other eyewitnesses, he felt that their culture had been devastated, their people's health had been devastated, if not, and all but destroyed. And so he brought this to Harrison's attention because he knew that Harrison was on the board of directors of the Hudson's Bay Company. Well, Hodgkin was kind of naive in that he was certain that Harrison was just too busy to know that this was happening. And really, as a member of the board of directors of Hudson's Bay Company, surely he would want to know how the company was misbehaving and the impact it was having on an entire people group. He was wrong. Harrison didn't want to know that. He didn't believe it was true. And he antagonized Harrison to absolute open hostility. Harrison ripped him apart verbally and continuously for an extended period of time, all through this job application process that Hodgkin had ostensibly gone down to talk to him about. Harrison had not forgotten how he felt when he received that letter. He accused Hodgkin of righteous impudence, and he critiqued him for everything from Hodgkin's audacity to daring to educate the poor on health issues, from his connections with a new University of London medical school that was in the beginning stages, which would be in competition with Guy's medical training facility. And he told Hodgkin that Quakers like you have just become too political. You're just big trouble causers. So he basically ripped Hodgkin to shreds. And Hodgkin, needless to say, did not get hired for the position. He was scathingly humiliated throughout the application process. He was made to stand out and humiliated in front of his peers who were also applying for the position. He became so so upset by it himself that he knew that he could not go on working in that facility for this man any further. And so he quit on the spot both of his key roles at the hospital. He quit as the curator of the museum, and he quit as the inspector of the dead, and just walked away. And remember, when the word had come to him that he needed to come down and apply for this job, he was still on his sickbed. So when this period of some weeks of the application slash humiliation process had happened, he totally collapsed. He had a complete health breakdown. He had devastating, debilitating headaches. His left side went numb from his feet up through his hand, his foot up through his hand. He entered into major debilitating depression. His father and brother had to come and get him and take over all of his decision making for him. They moved him back out of town, back to a relative's house outside of London, and again brought Sarah number one in as his nurse. And he was ordered firmly, clearly, this time by his doctors, not only to not attend to any of his usual business, but to carry on no correspondence with anyone, to just leave it all laying, just not get involved in any way with any of these potentially controversial, upsetting topics. So he did that. And over the course of 6 months, he did slowly recover well enough that by the end of 6 months, one of the first things he did was he said, I'm ready to tackle the church head on this time. And so he wrote up a formal document explaining to the church why their policy on first cousin marriages was wrong and why they needed to change that policy effective immediately. Well, it didn't work. The church was having none of it. And so he and Sarah number one made their final goodbye. And that was the last we see of her in the picture of his life. He was finally well enough at that point to go traveling as long as he had companions with him. So he and some family members went to travel the continent. And that helped him in his recovery in that he got to not only get a change of venue, but he got to get reacquainted with some of his friends at various medical facilities around France and Italy, where he had traveled before, begin to rebuild or update his knowledge in medicine, what was the latest and greatest things happening, so that he'd be prepared when and if he did go back to the medical field. So after about a year, he did in 1838 return to England, and he took on an entirely new range of activities within the medical profession. He first started plans of trying to establish a brand new psychiatric hospital for Quakers. The Society of Friends had their own psychiatric facility way up in the far north of England, but it was too onerous of a journey for people living in the South when they were already in a debilitated enough psychiatric state to need that kind of care. It was just too far to travel. And he wanted something down in the area of London. So he had some success in the beginning of trying to set this up, and he had a staff ready to go, picked out. But it was a very expensive proposition, and he had to do it by trying to sell shares, if you will, getting people to invest in it. And it did not come together soon enough to hold the staff that he had found together. So finally, he had to let the whole idea drop. At approximately the same time, he had kind of gotten a name for himself then in the London area as someone who, as a medical person who knew some things about the psychiatric side of medical practice. So at one point, he was called in by the court to help in a rather sensational criminal trial that ultimately involved his helping to write the definitions of what constituted legal insanity from a medical perspective in such a way that it could be used in the courts. So very, very different from anything he had ever done before, but left his mark on that part of medicine. He gradually increased his involvement in medical and scientific organizations that he so loved. And then in 1842, this new medical school that had started at St. Thomas that was kind of in competition with Guy's it had begun to kind of languish. They contacted him, asked him if he would come in and be one of their lecturers. And they gave him some kind of a formative role where he would be involved in choosing lecturers and putting together the syllabi for various classes. And he seemed to have done a great job. He brought in excellent staff that were really good for the hospital. But for some reason, apparently without explanation, they wrote him out of the schedule after a year. They just simply, about a year into it, they just dissolved their relationship with Hodgkin. Never explained it to him. He felt in the afterwards that he was treated ultimately worse by them than he had been by King Harrison at Guy's, who had so brutally chased him out. That was the last academic post that Hodgkin would ever hold. He never went back to academia at that level. He did still belong to a national provident insurance company as the medical director, essentially in charge of physicians who were doing insurance, physical, that kind of thing. Sorry. He also joined as a physician at the new London Cutaneous Institution, essentially doing dermatology work. He published a second volume of lectures on pathologic anatomy, and he updated second edition of that publication he had put together for public health issues, particularly to serve the poorest of the poor in and throughout England. He continued to push for various levels of educational, medical education reform, and for better, more stringent adherence to licensing and new norms in licensing medical professionals. He continued to lobby on behalf of Liberia, and in 1849, the first president of Liberia had Hodgkin come in and be their go-between with the British government to exchange treaties establishing that new nation. In and out of these various organizations and these various breaks with institutions that he had been involved in, there were times where relationships would languish, friendships, professional friendships that he had thought were close and trustworthy. And at one point, excuse me, he wrote a letter to his brother, John, who was his closest confidant. Thomas was feeling kind of deserted and depressed, and he wrote this: "With so little to gratify in the retrospect, and with such a blank for the future, in what is the essence of celibacy, the consciousness of being held in all but universal indifference is most painful. I often think that I move in the interstices between the circles of affection and friendship and filter away like water spilt upon gravel. Not the least annoying part of it is that this must be owing to something defective or repulsive in myself." He was very hard on himself, and he had a hard time understanding why everyone didn't see the world exactly as he did and exactly with the level of exuberance that he did. Shortly after writing this letter, wait for it, he announces to his family that he's getting married to Sarah number 3. The Society of Friends made it very difficult for this Sarah to convert. She had been raised in essentially a non-religious home and was perfectly willing to learn and practice the tenets of the Society of Friends, and had already started that process with Thomas. But they made it really difficult for her to do so and to convert to their church. They made it an onerous process. They kept bringing her in to repeat already previously conducted interviews. Thomas and Sarah were just pulling their hair out over this poor treatment. And in fact, the level of the degree of cynicism that he would develop through this process of their finally approving the marriage was so great that it took a long time to heal. He never left the church. He never considered it, and he never would. But he was embittered deeply for a long period of time over the way they treated his fiancée. His family were taken aback at his choice. She was not highly educated. though she was a delightful and gracious lady. They were also disappointed because she was from the wrong class. She was from the lower working class. Her husband, she was a widow. Her husband had been a tailor, and they thought that she was beneath him. It didn't take too long after they were married, though, before, as the family got a chance to get to know her, that everyone realized that this was a match made in heaven. It was an altogether perfect match, and that they had never seen him so serene and so thoroughly happy, and remained so to the end of his days. Just a second here. All right, we've been there. I guess you can take another look at it. Thomas's life had hit full stride. His life was satisfying. His activities were filling well through his 50s. He maintained a small private medical practice. He continued to lecture from time to time when asked, and stayed, as I said, as the medical director of the life insurance company, and remained a part of his various other societies and activities. In 1857, his friend Moses Montefiore invited him on a trip to Jerusalem. Montefiore had been there before, and he had invested in a number of projects to help the poor Jews develop certain things like schools and whatnot. And there in the area of Jerusalem, he wanted to build an almshouse or another hospital as well. So he invited Hodgkin to go with him. They did that in 1857. While they were there, Hodgkin, always wanting to stay busy. Give me just a second. My screen is locked up for a second. There we go. This was a project. By the way, this windmill still exists. If you've been to Jerusalem, you've probably seen it when you're standing near Jaffa Gate. It's known as Montefiore's windmill. Montefiore had contracted this. He had it designed, had all the parts put together in Europe, then had it crated up, sent to Jerusalem, and it was going to be assembled there so that it could be part of a power plant to produce the I assume belt-driven power for a small mill there as a money-making proposition for a small Jewish community right outside the walls of the old city. I took this picture when I was there in 2015, and that was long before I had started studying anything of Hodgkin. If I had known that he had been involved in this, I would have made the effort to walk a few more blocks over and at least put my hand on it. He wanted to always be busy, of course. And so one of the things he did while he was there, prior to this being assembled, is he did a final review of the architectural plans for Montefiore to make sure there were going to be no surprises on the assembly of it. So he was, to a small degree, indirectly, he was involved with that. There were other trips that they made together, traveling into the north of Africa. In 1862, about 5 years after this trip, Lady Montefiore passes away. And one of her final wishes that she communicated to Dr. Hodgkin was, you need to promise to always accompany Moses with him on his future international trips. Perhaps partly as a physician, but probably largely because she knew how much the support of Thomas to Moses meant to him. Well, the Civil War is looming in the US. We're getting up close to the early 1860s. We're 1862, as I just said. Civil War is looming. Thomas had been heavily, increasingly involved with anti-slavery topics and groups. And as the idealist that he was not prepared for the Southern US passion in protecting their way of life that they would show during the course of the war. He also was not prepared for, say, the belligerency of the North in wanting to hold the country together. As a Quaker, he could not justify war as a solution to any wrong, not even to the evils of slavery. War was just simply not an option. So he had convinced himself it would never happen and that it certainly would not cure this problem of slavery. So once the war was underway, he kind of shifted his thinking to something more like, well, the wartime interruptions to transatlantic shipping might be a boon to the Liberian economy if we can get them to start producing more cotton and maybe even consider raising tobacco, so that those slaves who are freed and moving there will have even more of a chance to support themselves and then ultimately bring more and more freed slaves over. So he had kind of a pragmatic approach, even if he had had a naive approach to the entry into the war. Okay, in February 1866, we're drawing his story to a close now. Gosh, I think I might cry. February 66 is his second trip to Palestine. He was not doing well health-wise, and he didn't really want to go, but he deeply wanted to honor his commitment to Lady Montefiore. So he went. They traveled to Marseille, took a ship to Alexandria. He was getting sicker and sicker as the voyage went on. From Alexandria, where he was really quite ill, they traveled on to Jaffa. And by the time they reached Jaffa, he was so sick, he was almost comatose. He was in tremendous pain all of the time. He certainly couldn't travel any further. Part of Montefiore's goal in traveling at this time was that he wanted to be in Jerusalem in time for Passover, and it was just days away now. And he was a faithful Orthodox Jew. He could not miss that opportunity, and so he was tremendously torn. But he arranged for Hodgkin to stay with the British consular agent in a very comfortable home in Jaffa. He brought in the local doctor, had him stay. He left his top servants, Montefiore's top servants, with them. So Hodgkin was as well cared for as he could be, while Montefiore went up to Jerusalem. During the time that he rallied a couple of days after that, just enough to ask the doctor for him to take dictation for a letter to his wife. And this is part of what Hodgkin asked him to write to her. I wish, in the shortest terms, to say all that is loving, grateful, and affectionate to thee, to thank thee for thy great kindness, to excuse all my deficiencies. I lament the little service I have done. I would not leave thee without a letter. God bless thee. And he slipped into back into a lot of pain, not being able to communicate much, but then again rallied in his last hours, where he asked his doctor to pass on to his wife one more thing. He said, "Please tell her I want her to know that I have felt a constant flow of affection toward her." And the doctor went on to write, Thomas was granted freedom from pain in his final hours. And remained conscious to the last. Excuse me. The mist was just clearing off the gardens, and the morning breeze came laden with the perfume of the orange flowers as we laid him to his rest. So he died on April 4th, 1866. It's not known clearly what he died of. He had lifelong intestinal weaknesses of some type. It could have been dysentery. It could have been cholera. A cholera epidemic had swept through that area shortly before they passed through there. Hi, Kathy, I see you. How much time do you feel I have?
And you take whatever you need to wrap it
Okay.
up. We're at
Okay.
2:30, so.
Okay, I think I can finish in 10 minutes. That is it for Thomas's story. I wanted to show you another slide here. Montefiore was sent word right away. He came down from Jerusalem, went immediately to Thomas's gravesite and said his goodbyes to his friend, and went home to England and had a proper gravestone and obelisk made. He had the words you see carved on the rear of it, and then Hodgkin's wife and brother had the remainder of it you see carved on the front side of it. At the very bottom, you'll see a Latin phrase. That is the title that I gave to the talk today. Nothing of humanity was foreign to him. So that is in Jaffa. Thinking back about the trip I took there again, if I had known, I probably walked within a couple of blocks of this. When I took a walking tour of Jaffa one day, I had no idea of his story at that time, that he was buried there. So I wanted to step on from here, give you a moment to read that, and say, in all of this, I'm sure a lot of you do too, I have kind of a short list of, I don't know what I'd call them, superheroes, I guess, in the cancer or Hodgkin world. I would, after studying this, I would put him on that list, of course. One of mine, from the first time I read his book, he's not someone I've met, I've only read his book, a book that I found through Hodgkin International reference, is Dr. Vincent DeVita. And I took a quote from his book that I think we all need to remember, and give you a minute to read that. Yes, the Hodgkins and the DeVitas and the Stubblefields and the Effingers and all of our hemonc docs, our heroes, we need to remember that we are too. And the earlier you were treated, probably the greater degree of hero you might be considered, because we tolerated so much. Medicine has advanced so much, in part because of what we agreed to be put through. We need to remember that sometimes, that we have played a role that has benefited others. There's one last piece that is only tangentially related to this. It is something that I accidentally discovered in the last couple of years. I'll show you this. I was doing a little bit of research, a little bit of reading one day, and I must have asked the question, Googled the question, something like Hodgkin lymphoma in Israel. Israel is one of my personal magnificent obsessions. It's something that I've studied a good deal about, the modern state of Israel. I spent a month there in 2015. But here's what I discovered. In 2016, an Israeli medical study was published, and they learned, because Israel, from the time of statehood, has practiced a form of socialized medicine, they have thorough medical records on most citizens of the state. And certainly if they participated in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, the young adults would have even more thorough medical records that the government would have in their archives. So it's easy to do big research on big numbers of people. What they discovered in this study, looking back at the records, was in the entire world right now, the group of people who have the highest incidence rate of Hodgkin lymphoma are young Israeli women who were between the ages of 19 and 22 at diagnosis, if they were born and raised in Israel. The second highest group of incidents of Hodgkin lymphoma in the world is Israeli men with the same parameters, the same age group, that is about the age they would have entered the IDF if they were born and raised in Israel. If they were born in Europe or Russia and their parents emigrated with them to Israel, their incidence rate is no different than it was in their parents' home country. Their parents and their grandparents' incidence rates of Hodgkin lymphoma are the same as they were in the countries that they emigrated from. So obviously that begs the questions: what is it about Israel? So that's the question that the researchers, of course, are asking. Is it diet? Is it culture? Is it what is it about the environment? Is there some terrible commercial chemical pollutant that has everyone in the country has been exposed to? Highly unlikely. The north of Israel and Haifa, they've had a bad reputation, deservedly, over the last 5 to 10 years because they have unleashed a lot of carcinogenic chemicals in that part of Israel. Difficult to see how that could affect the lives of people living in Eilat, down in the southern tip of Israel. Also, interestingly, essentially the same numbers of incidence rates are true not only of the Jews in Israel, but of Palestinian Arabs, of Bedouin, of Druze, of the same approximate age, if they were born and raised in that territory. So I just tossed that out there. I've not been able to find any further extensions of that research. I'm sure the questions are being explored right now, but I thought you'd be interested to know that. Almost ironic, since he himself is buried there and had such a lifelong love for the Jewish people and his close friendship with Moshe Montefiore. So that is my story. That is his story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you all very much.